In the summer of 1962, the Virginia sun poured over wooden porches like flowing honey. Richmond was still a small town then. On Monument Avenue, the main street there, were only a handful of shops, a milliner's Mrs. Lewis's dressmaking place, and a general store that sold red apples and hard caramels. Church bells rang steadily every Sunday afternoon. People dressed neatly and greeted one another with polite nods. In that peaceful picture, Helen Marshall, 22, with eyes as blue as a shard of early autumn sky, moved through her life as lightly as a promise. She believed in something simple: marry the man she loved, have a small house with a white porch plant, a row of roses, and wait for her husband's footsteps on the stairs each evening. Robert appeared like a bold stroke of ink on pale paper. He'd moved from the city to work at the town's only bank. Tall refined his white shirts, consistently crisp his tie so neatly knotted that passers-by couldn't help but look twice. Helen met him at her cousin's birthday party just as the band played Unchained Melody on the record player. "May I have this dance?" Robert asked, offering his hand with a smile that seemed to make the room suddenly larger. Helen nodded, feeling as if her heart had just been led across a newly built bridge that had yet to be named. Their courtship unfolded neatly and appropriately keeping with a town where everything was easily gossiped about. For 6 months, they met beneath the maples in the park. Each evening, Robert drove Helen home in a blue Chevrolet, always stopping far enough away that neighbors would have nothing to talk about. Helen's father, Mr. Marshall, a man with a stern gaze and ironclad rules, had said from the start, "Good love doesn't drag on." And so, one Sunday afternoon, after roast chicken and apple pie, Robert went down on one knee and presented a ring with a pea-sized blue stone, saying the color matched her eyes. Helen cried not because of the ring, but because the long-held dream suddenly had a key to its door. The wedding occurred in the red brick church at the end of the street. Helen's dress was sewn by her mother and 2 aunts from fabric she'd scrimped and saved for months. It wasn't fancy, but every stitch smelled of hope. When the priest said, "May God bear witness," Robert held her hand so tightly that Helen thought she would never lose her way again. Applause, the clink of spoons against glasses, and well wishes felt like a thin coat of paint over a brand new life. They moved into a small white house on the city's east side with a magnolia tree in back that spread shade like a giant umbrella. Helen planted hydrangeas along the fence and hung a blue glass wind chime on the porch. Robert put his black briefcase beneath the desk and clipped together stacks of notes written in a fountain pen. "We're not flush yet, but he said I just gotta raise eyes bright as newly installed bulbs. I don't want you to worry about anything except turning this place into our home." Helen smiled, feeling she had truly touched something solid. She learned recipes from her mother: cornbread, chicken soup, peach cobbler, and wrote them into a cloth-bound notebook under dishes Robert likes. Each afternoon, she waited for the sound of his car turning onto the grass drive, the key in the lock. And Helen, "I'm home." Their evenings were simple: the radio with the news, Robert with his paper, Helen mending the seams of his shirts, and the occasional debate about a baseball team whose name she never remembered. Those little things stacked up into a warm wall that Helen leaned on, believing in tomorrow the way one feels in dawn. The first 3 years flowed as gently as the brook behind their house. Robert was promoted, and they bought a shiny new refrigerator that gleamed like a lake. One May evening, he suddenly walked into the kitchen, rolled up his sleeves, and said, "From now on, Fridays are mine. I want to cook for you." Helen laughed in surprise. In the 60s, men in the kitchen were as rare as snow in July. But Robert insisted, saying his mother had taught him a few dishes before she passed, and that a good husband should know how to spell his wife in the kitchen. Leaning against the wall, Helen watched him clumsily chop onions. Her eyes stung, yet her heart softened with happiness. In the cloth-bound notebook beneath dishes, Robert likes, Helen added a new line: "Robert's Friday's a tradition." The first Friday was lemon roast chicken over-salted, but Helen declared it the best she'd ever had. He said Robert opened a bottle of red wine to toast a hard week's work. They clinked glasses, and the porch wind chime rang like a good omen. Helen thought that if happiness had a sound, it would be exactly that, light and glass clear. In the following weeks, Robert kept performing pasta cream of mushroom soup and pan-seared steak. He learned quickly and patiently, always plating Helen's portion. First, smiling, the chef serves his lady. Friends who heard about it marveled and told Helen she was blessed. She blushed, laughed, and didn't dare admit that when Robert tied on the apron, he seemed to tie another knot around her heart. One night after cream of mushroom soup, Helen felt lightheaded. She assumed it was the wine. She'd never held her liquor well, and leaned back on the sofa. Robert hurried over, pressed his hand to her forehead, and said anxiously, "You're tired, aren't you? You've worked yourself ragged all week." Helen nodded and smiled it off. "I suppose so." Outside, the wind tossed a few dry leaves onto the steps, and the wind chime gave a longer than usual ring, like a faraway string being pulled taut. Helen closed her eyes and thought of the days ahead. Autumn would come. The hydrangeas would fade and bloom again. Fridays would bring more new dishes. Perhaps life only needed to be like this. She didn't know that somewhere inside the excessive gentleness of a perfect husband, a hairline crack had appeared, thin as a strand of hair, quiet as a sigh. Helen still believed. And sometimes belief is the door flung wide for things no one dares to name. As maple leaves began to yellow along Richmond's cobblestone streets that autumn, a new ritual slowly took root in the little white kitchen. Every Friday afternoon, Robert removed his jacket, neatly rolled his sleeves, and tied on the checkered apron Helen had sewn for him. He said it was our joint weekend reward, an evening just for the two of them. Helen would stand by the kitchen doorway drying the last dishes while watching her husband chop vegetables, sometimes so clumsily he nearly dropped the knife. In those moments, Robert would chuckle and say, "I'm still clumsy, but I want to try for you." These are simple words, but they warmed Helen through. For her, there was no sweeter proof of a happy marriage. Those dinners quickly became the talk among friends. When Helen mentioned that Robert cooked for her at church gatherings and small-town parties, a discreet envy flashed in other wives' eyes. They whispered, "You're so lucky. I wish my husband would do that." Helen smiled awkwardly, a hard-to-describe pride swelling in her chest. Each Friday, Robert opened a bottle of wine. A tough week deserves a wine send-off. Helen rarely drank, only wetting her lips, but still let him pour. The red spread through the crystal glass like a streak of light blood so beautiful she couldn't refuse. But after only a few months, Helen began to notice something odd. After dinner, her body suddenly felt leaden. Her eyelids drooped faster than usual. At first she blamed the wine. "I'm not used to drinking," she told herself. But then there were nights when she hardly touched her glass, and the same exhaustion smothered her, as if an invisible weight had been placed on her chest. Robert was always the first to notice. He hurried to pull out a chair, rubbed her shoulders, and said in a honeyed voice, "You're spent too much on your plate all week. Rest, I'll clean up." Helen let her head fall back against the sofa, listening to the clink of dishes from the kitchen, feeling gratitude and guilt. She told herself she was truly fortunate to have such a considerate husband. The strangeness didn't go away. It repeated. Every Friday, Helen would drift off right after dinner and wake on Saturday morning in their bedroom, already changed into a clean nightgown. Robert explained, "I carried you to bed. You were sleeping so soundly, and I was worried you'd get cold, so I changed your clothes." Helen blushed and believed like a child, trusting her father's arms. Then a new face entered the Marshall home, Marlene, a young woman who'd transferred from the city to work at the bank with Robert. He introduced her one Friday evening. She used to be a nurse before banking. "I thought you should meet. She could help if you feel unwell again." Already woozy and sleepy, Helen heard Marlene's soft voice. "I'll keep an eye on you. Don't worry." After that, as if by unseen arrangement, the doorbell rang every time Helen started to fade. Marlene stepped in, tidy dress in a neutral color, a concerned expression, two fingers gently pressing Helen's wrist to check her pulse. "You're probably just run down," she'd say. "My mother had the same thing. Don't worry, I'll watch over you." In her haze, Helen felt strangely comforted. Before long, Marlene became a close friend. During the day, she dropped by with city magazines, guided Helen in choosing more modern dresses, and even suggested repainting the living room to be in style. Helen accepted gladly, convinced she was lucky to have found a sincere friend. And yet for all of Marlene's attentiveness, Helen sometimes caught the quick look exchange between her and Robert, just a flicker as if the two shared a small secret. Then Robert would give Helen's hand a reassuring squeeze and smile, and she'd scold herself for being paranoid. What had begun as a romantic tradition slowly became a stage on which Helen didn't know she was standing. A ritual she believed proved love, but in the shadows it sowed the seeds of bleak years to come. As time passed, Marlene's presence in Helen's married life was no longer surprising. At first, she only came when Robert called out of concern for Helen's health. Gradually, her presence became as familiar as the armchair in the living room. Quiet always there, yet occupying a space that couldn't be ignored. Marlene was different from the other women in small-town Richmond. She always stood out tall with softly waved brown hair and a city polish. Walking beside Helen, modest in her hand-sewn floral dresses, Marlene drew silent admiration. She told captivating stories about city life, new fashions, and even Washington news, which the local paper hadn't printed yet. To Helen, Marlene was like a door opening out of their closed-off town. Marlene came by one September afternoon with the backyard bathed in honeyed light. She set a bag of magazines and a box of blush on the kitchen table. "Helen, you have such a lovely face. Try a little color, Robert will be surprised." Helen flushed, embarrassed, and moved. Since marrying, she'd been absorbed by cooking and laundry, rarely thinking of makeup. Under Marlene's deft hands, Helen tried a veil of blush. When Robert came home, he smiled, praising his wife for looking fresh, and Marlene, seated beside them, smiled too, an expression that held something Helen couldn't quite read. Day by day, Helen's trust in Marlene grew. She confided fears of sudden fainting spells and worries about being a burden to her husband. Marlene listened with sympathetic eyes and a low, steady voice. "Don't worry, Helen. Many women go through this. It could be nerves or a lack of sleep. I've seen it before." Helen exhaled, feeling she'd found a kindred spirit. Marlene also slipped into the household's other corners. When Robert was busy, she helped Helen paint the fence, choose new curtains, and even taught her how to bake French pastries. Outsiders would say Helen was lucky to have such a good friend. Helen believed it herself. Some Friday nights, hovering half awake, Helen caught murmurs between Robert and Marlene in the living room, not clear enough to make out words, only warm tones, a hint more intimate than usual. On Saturday mornings, finding Marlene in the kitchen brewing tea, Helen would ask, "Did you stay over?" Marlene smiled. "Robert was worried you might get worse, so I stayed to watch you. Don't fret." Helen nodded, brimming with gratitude, never once suspecting. One winter day, the wind whistled through the doorframe, and Helen was too weak to leave the bed after Friday dinner. Marlene sat nearby, palm on her forehead, voice gentle. "You need more rest, Helen. Don't worry. Robert and I will take turns caring for you." In her haze, Helen smiled faintly, feeling safe as if a wide pair of arms were sheltering her. Marlene's presence stretched beyond Fridays into the rest of the week. She'd appear with flowers or a book in the afternoons, claiming she was passing by. The little house began to bear Marlene's imprint, a modern patterned tablecloth, a trace of perfume in the living room, encouraging phrases that Helen repeated like a charm. Sometimes at church socials, a few neighbors gave them odd looks. Someone whispered, "Robert and Marlene seem very close." Helen would smile and say, "Oh no, Marlene is like a sister to me." The conversation would end, but their eyes still held unspoken thoughts. Helen waved it off. In her heart, she was certain no one understood Marlene better. Helen didn't know that her absolute trust was the tightening cord drawing her step by step deeper into a play that the two closest people in her life had been quietly staging. And at the end of each Friday night, as Helen sank into heavy dreams, soft laughter drifted from the living room and dissolved into the dark, as if it had never existed. Helen's family life seemed to flow in calm water in the following years. Robert continued his steady job at the bank. Marlene visited like a dear friend. Yet beneath that placid surface, small details began to reveal hairline fissures. One spring evening, bright lights and clinking glasses filled the room at a colleague's party. Helen saw Robert's hand brush Marlene's as he passed her a flute of champagne. The touch lasted only a heartbeat, yet long enough to stall Helen's heart. When their eyes met, something flickered, not the look of co-workers or friends. On the drive home, Helen summoned her courage. "Robert, I felt something wasn't right between you and Marlene." Robert laughed and shook his head. "You worry too much. She's your friend. I'm kind to her because I know how much you trust her. Don't let your imagination wear you out." "It sounded reasonable," said in that familiar, gentle tone. Helen fell quiet, as if she had tied a blindfold over her eyes to avoid something too painful to see. Fridays continued as usual. Helen drifted off after dinner and woke unnervingly tired on Saturday mornings. Doctors found nothing. Some said her nerves were weak, others blamed chronic stress. Robert sat beside her, hand in hers, his concern so convincing that Helen felt lucky to have such a caring husband. Meanwhile, Marlene moved in deeper. She was no longer just a visiting friend. She became a consultant for everything curtain colors, what Helen should wear to Women's Guild events. "You're beautiful, Helen, but you need a touch of freshness. Robert will be proud." The words were sweet as honey, and Helen believed Marlene truly wanted what was best. Gradually, the house bore more of Marlene's stamp than Helen's. Marlene chose the new armchair in the living room, as were the pictures on the walls. Sometimes Helen felt like a bystander watching someone else arrange her living space. But Robert would slip an arm around her and say, "Marlene has good taste. Be glad you have such a devoted friend." And once again, Helen let the doubt go. The dark wasn't always silent, though. One night, half drowsing after dinner, Helen heard Marlene's whisper from the living room, "Aren't you afraid the dose is too strong? She's very weak." Robert soothed her. "Don't worry. I know how to adjust." The words blew through Helen's mind like a cold draft, but the darkness swallowed her before thought could take shape. The next morning, when Helen hinted at what she'd heard, Robert chuckled. "You were dreaming. You had a fever and rambled all night. Marlene sat up for hours to watch you." His firm answer fell like a heavy blanket over her doubts. Helen stayed quiet, half believing, half not, but chose to deceive herself. The truth felt too cruel to touch. The 70s arrived, society changed, but for Helen, Fridays remained a loop without end. When Robert traveled for work, she felt unusually well, clearer, brighter, no fatigue. She told herself, maybe it's the lack of wine. But when Robert returned, everything reset. Neighbors began to whisper. A kindly woman once said softly, "Helen, don't you think Robert and Marlene are too close?" Helen forced a smile. "No, you misunderstand. They're just worried about me." Yet after the woman left, a nameless weight settled on Helen's heart. Deep down, she sensed something was wrong. But for years, she had practiced burying doubt, living inside the honeyed lie that husband and friend had so deftly built. The deceit was so subtle that even when truth knocked repeatedly, Helen turned away and convinced herself their happiness had never cracked. The winter of 1969 lashed icy wind against the window panes, leaving white frost trails. Helen sat in the living room, wrapped in her mother's wool blanket, listening to the pendulum clock. Robert had just cleared the Friday dinner, and Helen felt her eyelids grow heavy again. But that night, unlike the others, she forced herself to stay awake a little longer. For weeks, a suspicion had drifted inside her, one she dared not name. When the doorbell rang, Helen knew it would be Marlene. She entered with a worried face and a small pillbox in hand, as if to a script. "Robert called me. He was afraid you weren't well." The line was so familiar it had become formulaic. Helen managed a weak smile as dizziness surged. This time Helen didn't sink fully into unconsciousness. Her body was heavy, but her mind hovered between waking and sleep. In that state, fragments of conversation reached her. "Are you sure it's safe? Last time she was weak all through the next day." Marlene's voice was barely more than wind outside. "I cut it down. She'll sleep till morning." "Don't worry," Robert answered, cool and calm. Helen wanted to rise and ask, "What does?" but her body wouldn't move. Only her eyelids slit slightly. Words fell into her mind like stones tossed onto a still lake. Before they could join into meaning, familiar darkness swallowed her. In the morning, Helen woke in bed and changed into a nightgown. Robert sat beside her, hand on her forehead. You ran a high fever and rambled all night. I called Marlene. Thank God she helped. Helen blinked, chest tight. She wanted to say she had heard something, but the concern in Robert's eyes sealed her lips. Days later, Helen told Marlene while they folded laundry. Marlene laughed lightly. You must have dreamed. You're fragile. It's easy to hallucinate. I only helped bathe you. Robert was so worried. You have to know how much he loves you. Helen flushed, ashamed for doubting. Again, she soothed herself. I'm overthinking. But from that day, a hidden thorn lodged deep. She began to notice things she had once considered normal. Robert always plated her food himself. He insisted on pouring her wine, though she didn't like it. The glances between him and Marlene fleeting, yet conspiratorial. At a church women's gathering, Helen overheard two wives whispering that Marlene seemed awfully close to Robert. They changed the subject when Helen turned, smiling too brightly. Helen smiled back, but her heart ached. She began recording everything in a small notebook hidden in the bottom dresser drawer. Trembling lines Friday, dizzy after dinner. 9 p.m. Marlene arrived, heard whispers. Don't remember clearly. She couldn't yet name what she suspected, but instinct told her a cord connected the fainting spells and Marlene's constant presence. Robert still brought fresh flowers and kissed her forehead before work. To outsiders, everything looked so perfect that Helen sometimes felt mad for doubting. Yet on those Saturday mornings when fatigue still pressed on her shoulders, she felt like a bound captive inside a place called home. In a rare, precise moment, Helen made herself a promise. If it happens again, I won't let it pass. I will find proof. I need to know what hides beneath these Friday nights. The 70s drifted by like a thin mist wrapped around Helen's life. From Sunday to Thursday, Robert was tender and attentive, but a heavy curtain dropped each Friday, and her memories were scraps by Saturday morning. Robert climbed the ladder from branch manager to regional director. With every step he celebrated inviting colleagues and clients to the bright new house they had moved into. With Marlene's firm guidance, Helen appeared in finer dresses and was praised as the perfect wife of a successful bank executive. On the surface, the image gleamed. Inside, Helen felt like a display piece carefully arranged to ornament her husband's success. Talk in town grew. At parties, Helen caught the sympathetic looks of older women. Once their next-door neighbor Margaret pulled her aside and whispered, "Helen, don't you see, are Robert and Marlene too close?" Helen forced a smile. "Marlene is a good friend. He's just being kind." Margaret fell silent, her eyes glinting with pity. Helen dismissed it then, but couldn't shake that look in the long nights afterward. Robert explained Helen's Friday spells as his wife's nervous weakness. Holding her hand in front of the doctor's, he'd say she needed rest, and not to worry. Helen submitted too exhausted after dozens of doctor visits with no answers. Diagnoses were vague neurasthenia anxiety. Some recommended mild sedatives. Helen stopped resisting and accepted weakness, just as Robert often said. Marlene wound herself deeper on Fridays and with flowers and city magazines throughout the week. Helen leaned on her advice for everything shopping decor, even small talk at crowded parties. Sometimes looking in the mirror, Helen no longer recognized herself. The dress, the hair, the lipstick, everything bore Marlene's imprint, not her own. Silver threaded Helen's hair by the 80s and age spots freckled her hands. She realized she'd lived 2 decades inside a fog suspended between wake and sleep, trust and doubt. Each Saturday, she forced a smile, telling herself it was only fatigue and that her husband and friend cared for her. But in rare moments of stillness, a deep hollow opened in her, as if life were being shaved away piece by piece. When Robert became regional director, the town club hosted a grand party. Helen wore Marlene's blue dress and stepped into a blaze of light. Applause swelled as Robert gave his speech arm around her waist. She saw people watching her for a heartbeat beat with a strange admiration and smiled on while a tremor spread quietly inside. Through those years, odd signals surfaced: a silk scarf in Robert's closet, scented with unfamiliar perfume. Waking late one night to soft laughter in the living room, and when she stepped out finding only Marlene rising to say goodbye. She smothered such signs with straightforward explanations. To admit the truth would mean destroying the world she clung to, and after so many years, she lacked the strength for collapse. Decade after decade, Helen walked in fog. Ordinary days slipped by, but every Friday opened a dark pit whose bottom she never reached. In that thick mist, Robert and Marlene stood both as comforting shoulders and as shadowy figures weighing down her heart. By 1984, at 44, life seemed to move on familiar inertia. Saturday mornings were hazy. Robert set a coffee before her with gentle concern. Marlene smiled worriedly when Helen asked about her mysterious illness. Then a seemingly trivial event lit the fuse that would rouse Helen from years of fog. Robert took her to a new Dr. Paul, a young physician in the next town. Unlike the older doctors who'd waved her off as nervous, Paul listened closely, eyes tracking every detail. After hearing about the Friday night spells, he frowned slightly. "Have you ever considered that the issue might come from dinner or something particular to that day?" Helen was startled no one had asked so directly. Before she could answer, Robert cut in firm and calm. "No. I cooked for her that day. Everything is clean and safe. She's just under too much stress." Paul said nothing, but his serious look gave Helen a chill. As he saw her out, he murmured, "If you can keep a small sample of the food or drink next time, we can test it." Helen nodded. A tiny, long-suppressed doubt sparked to life. The following week she tried. When Robert made his special cream soup, she quietly spooned some into a small glass container, planning to hide it. Before she could, Robert walked in. "What are you doing?" His tone was even, but his eyes drilled into her. "I wanted to save it so I could try your recipe tomorrow," she stammered. Robert smiled, but it never reached his eyes. He took the container, opened it, and poured the soup straight down the sink. "I'll make it for you whenever you want. No need to keep it." That night, the haze wrapped heavier than ever. In the morning, her head pounded and jagged memories flared. Robert's low voice in the kitchen, Marlene's soft replies, a stifled laugh, all blending like a nightmare she hadn't dared to name. Weeks later, Helen tried another way. She accepted the wine Robert poured. When he turned for dessert, she tipped it into the potted plant in the corner. The soil drank a pale red stain. Dinner went on. Even without a sip, the same wave of vertigo crashed over her. She lay on the sofa, body leaden, yet her mind stayed sharper this time. Through the slit of her lashes, she saw Marlene enter, coat tossed on a chair. She sat beside Robert and whispered, "She's out." Robert nodded. "Didn't even need the wine. The dose is strong enough. We're fine tonight." A small laugh, fingers interlaced in the dark. Helen's heart pounded, tears soaking the pillow as she kept still. The suspicion buried for years emerged stark and merciless. The husband she trusted, the friend she treated as family, they had staged an extended play over decades, and she had been the lulled innocent. She lay motionless until they withdrew to another room. In the dark, she opened her eyes and stared at the ceiling. For the first time in more than 20 years, she knew she was not sick or nervous. She had been deceived, controlled, and robbed of youth and freedom. That night, she was no longer the perfect wife. She breathed in long breaths and vowed, "Breathe on today. I will remember. I will not forget anything again." In the fall of 1987, cold came early to Richmond. Maples outside turned deep red leaves, spiraling in every gust. Robert went to a 3-day banking conference in Chicago. The house fell quiet, an ordinary business trip to most, but to Helen it was a rare chance to breathe, to lift the suffocating fog of years. There had long been one space Robert discouraged her from touching: the attic. He claimed it held only old bank papers and dusty storage. Not worth the trouble, he'd say, smiling and squeezing her shoulder. With sunlight pouring through the window and the house utterly still that morning, Helen decided to cross that invisible boundary. She propped the wooden ladder and climbed slowly. The hatch creaked, releasing the damp odor of aging wood and old paper. Under the weak glow of a lone bulb, she saw boxes, old suitcases, and dusty Christmas decorations. She began to sort things, telling herself she would prove there was no secret at all, just the overthinking of a middle-aged woman. But when she reached a small metal box wedged beneath a pile of files, her heart hammered. Sitting down, hands shaking, she lifted the lid. Inside were tiny bottles, each precisely labeled Friday 1978, Friday 1982, Friday 1985, dozens of them, some empty, some with powder or pills. Beside them lay a leather-bound notebook in Robert's neat script, dose reduced by 1/3, good effect. Asleep by 9, awake at 7. No memory. Helen's stomach knotted. She picked up the bottles. The repeated notations read like a sentence handed down by an unseen judge. Every Friday she'd collapse, believing she was weak or ill, each one plotted and measured. Robert hadn't merely betrayed her. He had turned his wife into a lab subject tracking responses with clinical coldness. She forced herself to turn pages. Later entries were even more explicit. Result: deep sleep, easy to handle. No detection. Marlene provides steady support. The words drove into Helen's heart like a blade. Marlene, the dear friend, the emotional anchor, appeared naked on the page partner to Robert in the long con. She wanted to stop and throw it away, but her eyes caught a brown envelope at the bottom. She opened it with trembling hands. Dozens of photos spilled onto the wooden floor. Helen reeled at the sight of herself lying inert on the sofa, eyes closed, body like an abandoned doll. Behind her, Robert and Marlene laughed, poured wine, and embraced within the frame. In some, they moved toward the guest room, intimacy blatant on their faces. The photos span over 20 years, arranged neatly like a sick collection. Helen collapsed onto the cold floorboards, breath-ragged tears soaking her collar. She instantly saw her life cave in, 30 years of marriage, sacrifice, and trust, reduced to a vicious joke. The photos were not only evidence, they were mockery proof that her blindness had been expertly exploited. When the shock subsided, a rare clarity rose in her. She drew a deep breath, gathered every bottle, the notebook, and the stack of photos into a cloth bag, and hid it deep beneath her wardrobe floor. She dried her tears, restored the attic exactly as it had been, and left no trace. Robert would not know she had seen it all. That night, Helen lay alone, listening to the wind rake the roof. For the first time in years, she no longer asked, "Am I truly ill?" Nor did she try to soothe her doubts. Everything was brutally clear. Robert and Marlene had not only betrayed her, they had stolen her memories, her youth, her dignity for 3 decades. In the darkness, Helen stared up at the ceiling. A slow flame rose in her chest, not fear, but resolve. She whispered a private oath. "No one will blind me ever again. This time I will keep my own secret, and I will get out." When Robert returned from Chicago, Helen stood on the porch with her familiar smile. She had hidden every trace of what she'd found. Her voice was warm, her hand ready to take his suitcase. Only one thing had changed. Her heart had closed behind that smile. She knew she couldn't confront him openly. Robert was too adept, too practiced at manipulation. An accusation without airtight proof would have her dismissed as paranoid. This time, Helen would move with the same quiet calculation he had used on her. First, she began to save money. Each time Robert handed her grocery cash, she skimmed a few bills and hid them in the worn lining of an old handbag. Over months, the sum grew, not much, but enough to start. In parallel, she met an elderly lawyer named Mitchell in the next town, someone outside Robert's circle. She carried a few photos in her briefcase, part of the notebook, and several small bottles. After a long look, Mitchell sighed and said gravely, "You hold a dangerous truth, but if you want freedom, this is the key." Helen nodded, eyes dry. She didn't cry anymore. The tears had long since run out. In the weeks that followed, she kept playing the dutiful wife. She still cooked from Sunday through Thursday and let Robert handle Fridays, but now she slipped their net. When he poured wine, she dabbed her lips and emptied it into a plant. When he served the main dish, she ate little and claimed fatigue. She trained her body to stay alert, learned to control her breathing and feign sleep. From behind half-closed lashes, she noted every move, every complicit glance. She recorded each detail in her hidden notebook, dates, times, and even Marlene's perfume. She had transformed herself from a helpless victim into a silent observer. In early December, Robert received an early retirement package from the bank. He spoke excitedly of future trips and a new chapter together. Helen smiled back, but it was the final piece in her mind. Once the money landed, assets would be clear, and the path out would be smoother. On December 31st, 1987, they attended the town club's New Year's Eve party. Robert escorted his wife under the lights and music while Marlene appeared in a blazing red dress. Helen looked at them and felt no jealousy, only a cold distance. She knew tomorrow everything would change. At midnight, Robert hugged her. "Happy New Year, good health." Helen held his shoulder and whispered, "This year a lot will change, Robert." He smiled, oblivious. On the morning of January 2nd, while Robert was still sleeping off the long night, Helen quietly took the small suitcase she had prepared weeks before: clothes, essential papers, and the proof dossier. She left an envelope on the kitchen table. Inside a single note: "Robert, I know everything. Don't look for me. My lawyer will be in touch. Helen." She opened the door and stepped out without looking back. The taxi was waiting. As the car rolled away, Helen leaned into the seat, watching bare trees slide past. A shiver of fear and relief ran down her spine. After 30 years, she was finally out of the invisible prison. In the following days, Helen stayed in a small apartment Mitchell had arranged. Robert called and wrote, sometimes pleading, threatening, but she didn't reply. All communication went through the lawyer. When Robert realized the evidence was incontestable, he was forced to negotiate. In early February 1988, Helen signed the divorce papers. She received half their assets, including a portion of Robert's new pension. The document was thin, but to Helen it was a passport into a new life, a life in which for the first time she held the authority. In the first days after the divorce, Helen lived in a small suburban apartment like a stranger stepping into a new world. Everything around her was stripped down: an old wooden table, a single bed by the window, and a narrow wardrobe for a few clothes. But to Helen, that emptiness felt like the first breath after decades of being pressed down. No Robert, no Marlene, no haunted Friday dinners. Only silence, and a woman nearing 50 facing herself. She sat by the window each morning, watching sunlight spill across the gray roofs. She brewed a weak tea, sipping slowly, and letting the bitterness spread across her tongue. For the first time in years, she didn't have to accept anyone else's explanations or feign a smile. Freedom came with a frightening void. Who am I? She wondered. If I am not Robert's wife, if I am not Marlene's best friend. One afternoon, she walked into the city library. Rows of tall shelves breathed the scent of old paper, reminding her of a youth never fully lived. She timidly chose a novel and sat at a wooden table in the corner. Page by page, she realized she had long abandoned her love of books, something marriage and betrayal had stolen. From that day on, Helen came almost daily, taking careful notes as if to make up for lost time. Gradually, she enrolled in an evening literature class at the local college. She was the oldest in the room, silver hair standing out among 20-somethings. At first, she felt self-conscious. Then the students' curiosity and eagerness made her feel young again. When the professor asked for thoughts, Helen spoke about characters and marital tragedy with a truth drawn from her own life without giving details. The class fell quiet, then nodded. She understood her voice had never truly vanished. It had been suppressed for too long. Alongside study, Helen joined a volunteer group reading to elementary school children. The first time she entered a classroom and saw those bright round eyes, a simple joy rose. Reading The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, she heard laughter and delighted cries. She realized she wasn't just telling stories, but reclaiming a part of her stolen soul, the ability to touch hearts with words. In 1995, Helen met August, a widowed children's author, at a literary seminar where she was volunteering. Tall and weathered, with kind eyes behind his glasses, he spoke with her about Mark Twain and stories that help a child feel less alone. Coffee dates led to long walks beneath autumn trees. To her surprise, this love was not dependency or fear of loss, but companionship. They didn't marry. Instead, they lived together in a small house with a backyard garden. At 50, Helen planted flowers for herself for the first time, not to please anyone else. She wrote her memories into journals that became short stories. August read each draft, urging, "You have your own voice, Helen. Let it be heard." Those words emboldened her to send a first manuscript to a local press. The book was thin and straightforward, but when Helen held it, she knew she had entered a new life, one she authored. In the following years, Helen kept writing and teaching, traveling to tell stories to children. She no longer avoided the past, but didn't let it imprison her. When news came that Robert had died of Alzheimer's, she sat in silence, feeling the bitter irony of fate. Marlene had left town for the South, living alone and rarely mentioned. Helen no longer hated. She understood that carrying hatred was only another form of captivity. At 85, Helen sat in a room crowded with books, gazing at the garden beyond the window. Her life split cleanly in 30 years in darkness and nearly 40 in the light. She had lost so much, yet found herself again. Most importantly, she had learned to claim authorship of her story, no longer a supporting character in someone else's play, but the sole author of her own life.